Let's go ahead and get started. Thank you so much for arriving today and taking time out of your day to come to the fourth webinar of Professional Development Week by Insight Pack, #Skills Amplified. My name is Hermes Huang. I am one of the co-founders and managing partners at Insight Pact based in Bangkok, Thailand. I have been a facilitator for over 10 years now, working with large intergovernmental, bilateral aid, and nonprofit organizations across Asia and the Pacific. And I'm really happy to be here with all of you today. It's great to see some familiar faces. For those of you who are joining us for the second, third, or fourth time this week, thanks so much and welcome back. And for those of you who are just joining us for the first time, welcome, and I hope you have a wonderful time. Now, I think that those of you who have joined a few times have now heard four versions of my introduction, so it's you're getting lots of different facets of my background over the course of this week. But I'm joined today by my colleague, Romano Theunissen, who is actually our Director of Research and Innovation at Insight Pact. And we are going to be talking about design futures, going beyond paper prototypes today over the course of the next hour. And we'll be sharing with you a methodology that we are working on right now at Insight Pact, combining the elements and principles and values of foresight practice with design thinking in order to create what we are calling futures assisted design. But as with every single introduction that I've made this week, I'm leaving out gaps because I want to make sure that our guests are able to A, introduce themselves, and B, also share a little bit about their work without these gaps in it, because I'm not an expert all the time about every topic that we've talked about this week. So with that, I'm very happy to throw it over to you, Romano, to give a little bit of introduction about yourself as well, and a little bit about your thoughts on design futures.
Alrighty, thank you very much, Hermes. Also, thank you very much for pronouncing my last name wrong after 2 years. It's still happening. But no worries at all. My name is Romano Theunissen. Hermes said incorrectly. I am born and bred in South Africa, but have lived all around the world from Mexico to Taiwan for the last 10 years now. I am a professional futurist. So I spend a lot of my time looking into crystal balls, trying to predict. I'm joking. I do not look into crystal balls. I do not predict the future. But basically what I do is as a futurist, I help people think about the future. And then figure out what that thought about the future means for their day-to-day lives in the present and how they can shape decisions in the present to achieve some goal in the future, whether it is personal, professional, organizational, national, or even international and civilizational. That's a lot of big words. And I think I'll pause there, because I think a lot of my views on design, on futures, on the baby that they create will come out throughout the session.
Great. Thanks so much, Romano. Okay. Some of you may already be a little bit like overwhelmed with the words that we're using. But so what I want to do first is give us a chance also to see what's going on within the room in terms of where people are at. So we're going to go ahead and launch a quick poll just to see where we're at. So we can go ahead and launch that poll. How familiar are you with futures studies or foresight practice or futures thinking? All kind of the same. And we'll go ahead and share the results of this poll in just a few moments. Okay. Let's go ahead and end that poll and then share the results with the audience. So it looks like in general, we're leaning towards the side where we don't know very much about future studies or foresight practice. So I think that is worth us starting with a little bit of an introduction, Romano, about what futures studies or foresight practice is and means for this audience or in general, really, and what it means for as a body of knowledge. I also I also want to make sure that you as an audience feel comfortable as much as possible to also type into the chat and yell at us throughout this hour and say like too academic or like I don't get that word. So if we can literally when you hear something like that you're just like what what the heck are they talking about? Truly, truly, just like even if you think that there's a word that we're using that you think that somebody else in the room might not get, type into the chat, let us
Mm-hmm.
know because we will pause because this is all for you, for
Mm-hmm.
those of you in the audience.
Yeah.
So I was going to go into an anecdote now about how Romano and I even got into this conversation about design and futures. But I think, Romano, I'll throw it over to you first to talk a little bit about what futures is at all.
100%. No, and to double down on what Hermes said, please jump in and ask for clarifications. I am famous for two things, I think. One, talking too much, and two, becoming very aloof academic, using too many weird words. So yeah, please bring us down to earth when needed. Okay, what is futures studies? The academic definition of future studies is the study of the possible and probable visions of the future. So that's the first part. It's to talk about what people want to see in the future, what might happen in the future, possible, so meaning whatever, and probable, more likely, as well as the worldviews, myths, and metaphors that support those visions. So we've got a double kind of definition here. It's the idea of what might happen in the future, as well as what do we hold now in the present and from the past that shape what we want to happen in the future.
So, so what does this mean? Like, are hopes and dreams like a future? Like, are if I hope that I will have like in 10 years, like a family, is this something that someone like what is
Yes.
that? Is that a possible future or a probable future or what is it?
Well, let's put it this way. First, yes, it is part of the future. A colleague, old professor, friend of mine would often say that to be human is to think about the future. We all think about the future in some way, shape, or form for our own lives. Whether that is, do I want a family? Do I want to be a millionaire? Do I want to buy a car in 10 years? Where do I want to live? What do I need to go on a diet? I clearly do. All of these things are possibilities of the future, very localized, very individual, very personal. And the difference between possible and probable is the decision that we make in the present. When we start to expand a little bit more and we think about on a grander scale, what are the possible or probable visions for Bangkok? Or what for Thailand, for the world, whether we want to talk about climate or production lines in your organization. This is when the possible and probable line begins to blur because it is a collective one desire that we're trying to reach for.
So what I'm hearing is that, of course, when we're talking about things close to us, whether individual hopes and dreams
Mm-hmm.
or possibilities, or even family level hopes and dreams and possibilities for the future, that is, of course, one level of complicated. Um, but when we're talking about like climate change or security at
Mm-hmm.
societal, national, global scale, and we're doing this visioning this idea of like imagining what are the hopes and dreams for the future of the planet and we're doing this with other people, it gets increasingly complicated because we're dealing with different cultures, different lived experiences, different backgrounds, and it sounds pretty heavy actually to be able to do that.
Yes, 100%. I'm going to say that term a lot, 100%. Something I say. Forgive me. But it gets very complicated. It gets very complex. It gets very heavy. Um, and I think that is something that future studies does well. You'll hear a term thrown around a lot in the futures world called participatory futures. The idea that everybody needs to have their own agency and voice in the conversation. And that creates a very messy conversation. And so, what many futurists have done is they've come together with, in very similar way that design thinking has done and facilitation has done with liberating structures that we spoke about on Monday. They've brought together a series of methodologies, tools, tricks, ways of having a conversation that is semi-structured, but that uses those different voices and the complexity that surrounds it to create inclusive visions of the future that we can all work towards. I'm using big words again.
Yeah, let me try to bring that down a little bit. So, oh, that's a great question, Rosanna. Um, what I'm hearing from you, Romano, too, is that future studies and foresight practice or futures thinking, let's use them all analogously or the same for this moment. I'm sure that there are nuances to the difference between them. But what I hear is that it's not only just an academic like field. Like it's not
Yeah.
just people writing papers and thinking about it, but this heaviness that I mentioned of holding conversations that involve a lot of people's lived experiences put into a big, like messy space together in conversation that futures studies and foresight practice offers maybe some tools that will help a facilitator, whether an individual or collectively facilitated conversation, to try and make sense of lots of people's hopes and dreams and fears and anxieties about what many different futures could look like for a lot of different people.
Yes, 100%. And I think a good example might be I don't know where everybody is based, but I'm sure we're based in different cities all around the world. Not all of us are in Thailand. But when you look around the city or your town, your neighborhood, I'm sure you'll see some form of a development happening, right? That development, the decision to develop that piece of land, whether it is for an apartment building or a mall or a park, that was a decision made by somebody in the past for the future, right? At a very basic level. Bangkok has the lovely Benjakati Park that has now been developed and is being used by a bunch of people. Um, and so, what Futures does is instead of just saying this is what an elite group of people wants for the future of the city, we'll rather say this is they'll use a set of participatory methodologies and activities, bringing more people into the conversation and not just saying, hey, what do you want for the future? But taking people through a process where the baggage that we hold gets aired in a safe space. And when we can address these and talk about these and form a united vision of the future. If you want to bring it into a more personal conversation, if I really want to have a child, I decide, you know what, Romano wants to be a dad. I could do whatever I really want to do, but I can't make that decision without my partner. My partner needs to be involved in the conversation. And if I choose to say, screw it, I'm making the decision by myself, I probably won't have a I have to involve my partner into the conversation. And the way in which I have that conversation could either embrace my partner's worldviews and we could riff off of each other, or it could ignore my partner's worldviews. And then that would also lead you to either have a partner or not have a partner. And that is what Futures does, is that it creates this space where worldviews and ideas can come together and play, and then something can come out of it.
Okay, cool. So what I'm hearing too is that there's an invitation from the future's toolbox, let's say, that
Mhm.
is also saying like if you do this by yourself, if you imagine your own future by your own possible futures individually, you will also there are consequences to that as well, right? To do
Yes.
it together or to do it alone, there are
Mhm.
consequences to what the probability of our futures are, regardless of whether or not we involve people or not.
Yes.
So I see some great questions coming in, and I want to make sure that everyone gets a chance to ask a question at this point too, because I assume that everyone has at least a small question about what's coming up. So, like we've been doing the last few webinars, I want to do a chatterfall for the next minute or so. So, for those of you who have never done a chatterfall before, it's a facilitation technique that we use in the virtual space, where I will put a prompt into the chat and I will invite you to write an answer to that prompt in the chat, but do not press enter yet. We're going to give everyone a chance to think about their answer to this prompt. So the prompt is, what is a question that is rising for you at this point? And if you've already asked a question, so Kat, Adi, Razana, you're welcome to add another question, or you will remember that they're there. So go ahead and take like 15, 30 seconds to write your answer to this prompt in the chat. Maybe about another 10 seconds to write your question. Okay, and in three, two, one, go ahead and press enter. Okay, so this is why it's called a chatterfall, because it's like a waterfall of chats. And so you have this opportunity now to scroll up and down the chat box to see a number of different questions that this audience is curious about, given the conversation we've had already. So I'm going to take a look here as well. So I see from, again, Rosanna, what does having your own agency in a conversation look like? From Adi, in future studies, what are some common things that could disrupt the future? From Kat, what are some example tools that you use? How are they different from the tools that we've been talking about earlier this week, such as from liberating structures? Kai, how to make futures and foresight less of a commercial strategic activity and more about imagination and hope. From Nuria, how do we create the participatory space? And a whole bunch more questions down here. Can we also say that futures thinking is part of systems thinking? From Doma, fantastic. These are really, really great questions. We're going to try to answer as much as we can throughout our conversation. And I want you to yell at us in the chat or elsewhere if we don't get to your question, and we will make sure that we get to it at some point, even beyond the live conversation today. But I actually want to go all the way back to Rosanna's question right at the beginning. What does having your own agency in a conversation look like? This is a great question because yesterday in our conversation with Trishul from Beti Beta on diversity, equity, and inclusion, she made a really interesting point from her perspective, which was around how thinking about the future is a privilege and that a lot of people aren't thinking about the future because they don't have the time, the money, the space. They are thinking about when their next meal is going to be on the table. And this was a point that we had made. And this contrasts potentially, at least on the surface, to what Romano said here is that it is human to be thinking about the future. And so there's a question here that I see is that in having your own agency in a conversation, what Romano and I were actually talking about this contrast in particular is that I don't think that these two things are in contrast to each other. But what we're talking about is the time scale at which different people are able to consider
Mm.
the future, whether you're
Mm.
thinking one day in advance or 20 years in advance, and what's allowing you to be able to do that, whether through socialization, through daily pressures,
Mhm.
through the education systems that we've been through. And if I could give you at least one perspective, Rosanna, to this question, it is sort of around having agency in a conversation being means recognizing the power of your experience and being able to represent that in a conversation and let it contribute to what possible futures that a larger group of people see. And I think that that's a challenge actually for a lot of individuals and perhaps all of us as well, depending on the context we're included in or invited into speaking. I mean, there are definitely situations where I don't feel comfortable representing my own lived experience, depending on the people around me as well. And therefore, it's hard for me to choose and have the agency in that conversation to create an outcome or possible futures that we're imagining in that situation. I don't know, Romana, do you have what
Yeah.
what do you think are tools
Okay.
for increasing agency, or like what do tools look like in a conversation that allow people to participate in a futures process?
So, so this is where I am going to. I'm very happy that the poll results at the beginning of the conversation kind of pointed to there not being many futurists or technically futurists in the room, because I'm going to piss a lot of futurists off. One of the biggest issues with future studies is, and has been for many years, the creation of this agency. Futures, even though it pushes for and advocates for participatory futures, it becomes very aloof. Let's talk about what's going to happen 50 years down the line, and it alienates people. It really does. And so there's been this work to really create actionable insights into how we can practice futures and foresight in the communities that need them most on the ground. There's a guy from UNESCO, his name's Real Miller, and he runs a program called Futures Literacy. Futures Literacy has been doing most of its work in Sub-Saharan Africa and in Southeast Asia and Latin America for the most part. Um, I don't have a link for you. I apologize. But there's a lot of real actionable tools and tricks that are used to create agents. Um, but to answer Rosanna's question very specifically, what does agency um, look like? I'm trying to find it again in this chat of all. What does having your own agency in a conversation look like? I will not ask Rosanna to answer the question again, but I will to answer this question rather. But I will say, what does it feel like to have a voice? If you haven't had a voice in the past, if your voice has been excluded, to be invited to the table. And I think from my personal experience, when I'm invited to the table, that first step is a huge step to go. This is what I think. To answer the next question, which is somewhere in here, which is, I think, from Kat, examples of tools I use or you use and how they're different from the other tools to create agency, I think that being invited to the table is not enough. Is how do we shape that conversation so you feel like you have a voice? One of my favorite activities that I've always done in futures is an activity called the Pollock game. I will type it into the chat. The Pollock game. And what this, not Polar, Romano. I used to be an English teacher and I can't spell. So just deal with it the way it is. But the Pollock game is a movement-based game. I will try find an actual link to a resource that you can use. But it's a game that involves a lot of movement, embodying that movement and moving around the room. But what it does is first ask you, how do you see the world? Do you see the world as something that is great or terrible? Very short. And then the second question is, Um, how do you see your own agency within this world? Can I enact change, or there's nothing that I can do? So this very quick and terrible explanation of this activity, what it does is that it first highlights that we all have different opinions. So when I've run this in the past, I have a spread of very hopeful people who are very energetic and they want to do everything and they feel like they can. And then a lot of people who go, oh, let's not swear too much. Oh no, this is terrible. There's nothing that I can do. The world is going to go down the toilet. And what this does then is, as we move through other types of activities, these different perspectives come together, and there are arguments. There are lots of arguments. Um, there are lots of conversations. There are lots of tension, but it creates a vision that everybody can get on board with. And so it creates the space where you can see your voice is different, and then through other activities, more elevated.
Okay. So let me try to repeat back and how I understand it in maybe slightly different words to see if it will also hit a little differently. Because I think that even the example that I put here with the Pollock game, would you say, Romano, we often do a warm up at Insight Pact called this or that. And what we basically do is put on a slide summer or winter, and we ask the people in the room to move to the side where
Mm-hmm.
where which one they prefer. So if people like if this is summer and this is winter, people will move to decide if they like summer, and people will move to decide if they like winter. Put up
And if they
another
move to
slide.
winter, they are wrong.
No. And then we'll put up another side where it might be like rice or noodles, and people will be shifting. Yes, Android or iPhone one. People will be shifting, and it gives people a chance to embody a little bit of a space, right? So it gets them out of their head because they're moving around, um,
Mhm.
and it is visual, right? You can see the other people in the room, so it gives people a chance to essentially like embody by moving their own take on that, but seeing the spread of people in the room. I think this comes to start to answer actually Alex's question here very lightly, Alex. I don't want to, I feel the gravity of your question as well. But what I'm seeing with this example with the Paula game is that it just starts to give people a chance to non-verbally express like answers to a question. And so the Pollock game, what I understand is like it can come in different variations. So similar
Mhm.
to what we talked about with liberating structures on Monday, there's might be one standard way that is written on paper, but you make up the the different options to up gauge or down gauge the activity. So with the Pollock game, instead of going left or right part of the room, you might do four corners of the room with your different
Mhm.
options, for example, and you're giving people that chance to recognize the diversity of lived experiences if you are prompting people to go to different areas of the room. And it gives people the choice. So it comes back to Rosanna's question as well, is that agency also looks like being able to walk and represent yourself in a set of options potentially. Again, light touches to encourage. But is what I'm saying, you feel like it's adding on to what you're saying or contrasting with what you're saying, Romano?
Um, I would definitely say adding on, and I'm reading Alex's question here. Is there a way, and my eyes are so bad, I apologize. Is there a way to encourage people to process their lived experiences and top concerns and then plan their futures in a way that is more empowered, proactive than reactive? And I think this is kind of the point of the topic of this webinar, which was beyond paper prototypes, futures aided design. Um, First off, I think that um, there is no shortcut
Actually,
for.
before we go on, I'm sorry, Romano. I actually do want to make sure that actually, Alex, you're not just here to to necessarily like listen, but I would love to hear is if
Mhm.
the example we just provided with the Pollock game and the explanation, does that begin to answer your question a little bit as well? I don't want to just like say it and then like assume that we've answered like the question in the way that you wanted to pose it. Okay, I see here in the chat. I also want to let you know, like, if we ever address any of you in the audience, like, feel free to turn on your mic and hop in as well. But heard and read, Alex, thanks so much. And if you have further questions that add on to that, just respond, react. We're here for it, right? Also, those of you who are putting resources into the chat as well, Kai, thanks so much for this blog. Like, if you're hearing something, put it in. Like, this is a conversation that's not meant to be um isolated to Romano and myself. But what I hear from you, Romano, is that yes, we're actually starting to get into what about the design part of this webinar that
Yes,
we're talking about as well. So, Romano,
yes,
over to you.
yeah. Like I was going to say, there is no shortcut for participatory anything and inclusive anything. There is no pill that we can take or a box that we can check to say, this is now participatory. It requires getting on the ground and going to communities and essentially doing the grassroots work. And what I hope we have started moving towards here at Insight Pack, especially with this thing called Futures Aided Design, or FAD for short, is moving into a space where there is a toolkit, um, eventual toolkit or process where we can take this heady idea of a 20-year future or 50-year future and make it real. What does this mean for 5 years? What does this mean for your design? Whether you're the designer trying to build something or design something, a solution that is for 7 years down the line or 3 years down the line, a lot more actionable. Kai's paper that he posted in here by John Sweeney, which is actually a great paper to read. I met John, I spoke to him about what he's trying to do, is this representation of taking these big ideas and making them real. How are we going to make things real for the person trying to design a 7-year solution, instead of always talking about this big abstract 20-year thing? Because futures gets lost and we go 20 years, 50 years into the futures. And I think, in my opinion, and this is where a lot of you please disagree with me, design thinking also gets lost. Because design thinking, in my opinion, is also too short-term focused. And so what we're hoping with FAD is to bridge this gap a little bit more, to go, instead of a 1 to 3 year idea, but maybe 5 or 7 years into the future, and design for that and help people understand that future instead of going over to 20 years.
Yeah, and just before we even dive into this too much, I want to make sure that I lay out a little bit of what we mean by design as well. So I am in this conversation, at least between me and Romano, I'm much more of a designer. My background in the last 10 years of being a facilitator has largely been informed by co-creation, human-centered design thinking processes, and simply in my perspective about when we talk about design is building stuff, right? Like thinking of a solution to a problem and then making it. And part of it is really the how. The how is what we're talking about. And so from my perspective, it is this co-creation element. How do we involve more people at every step of the process to build a solution to a problem? And it's not, the challenge is not so much about building the actual thing, although you do have to get there at some point. I have more to say on this later, but it is the how do we get the resources? How do we create the conversations? How do we create the spaces that allow us to involve as many people as possible every single step of the way? I mentioned earlier in the week, I'm a scientist. I was trained in physiology as my undergraduate degree, and so when I think about design, my roots in design. I also think sometimes about Western scientific method and how, as a scientist, we were given the tools to really come up with a question, have the tools, collect the data, and really find out something and to come to a conclusion. In that case, we're designing an experiment that will give us information. And I've always had issues actually with how this method, the Western scientific method, plays out in the wider sort of world, because it's not such a participatory process. It's not a particularly inclusive process, because you have to have really specialized sort of like knowledge, meaning access to education in general, to even understand these different steps and to participate in it. Of course, we have there's different processes, and I don't want to get into that. So a lot of my work in the last 10 years has been trying to figure out also, when we decide to solve a problem, how can we get as many people involved? I have a lot more to say about that, but I will save it for later. So part of this conversation around futures assisted design is not only about imagining the future, but as Romano said, then when you have a lot of different possibilities or probabilities of the future, how do we use the tools to actually take real steps together, and steps and tools that encourage us to continue working with the people around us as much as possible. And
Mhm.
so this actually does touch upon where is this question? Could futures be a tool for diversity and inclusion from Prabina? Or can we say that futures thinking is also a part of systems thinking? Um, I think the short answer is yes, but it is dependent on your own choosing, if you're the one leading a process, to make something more inclusive, more participatory, um, and how you're able to do that. Because one thing that both of these processes kind of depend on, right, or with any tool, is that somebody knows how to use the tool and still has to introduce it to others in a way that they can see themselves using it or actually participating in it. The second thing here about, um, sorry, so many great questions and I'm getting lost in them. Is futures thinking part of systems thinking? I think as soon as you start introducing, I mean, of course, we all exist in systems regardless, right? Whether we see it or not. But as soon as we start considering multiple people's perspectives, we're in it, right? We are in a system. And especially when we're thinking about complex futures and working together to think about those, it could be part of systems thinking. I think that Romano has a great diagram that actually sort of shows all this, but we don't have
So
it ready quite to share yet,
yeah,
that integrates systems thinking. But there are
I
nuances
will.
to these two things that I think that maybe we don't fully have time to go into, that will make sense when we just
I
talk
think
about it without visuals.
I will just as a very quick response to is futures thinking and systems thinking like related. Um, so in grad school, all futures programs do systems thinking as a module. So they are very, very closely related. And a good way to think about this is futures thinking or future studies is systems thinking with a time horizon. So it's not just what do we want the system to look like today or tomorrow, and what does it look like today, and what are those interrelated components now, but where can this evolve to, and what are the multiple different avenues that it could evolve into. And so that's a very interesting way of thinking about futures as systems thinking with a time horizon. I
Fantastic.
don't know if that answers that question a little bit.
I see a thank you from Doma. Okay. Um, okay. Futures and design. What are we doing here, Romano? Like 2 years ago when I first met you and you started working at Insight Pact, you told me these are incompatible. Like if as a
Yes.
futurist, you told me that you couldn't possibly think of yourself as someone who could imagine the future and then create solutions to solve things with design today.
Yes, this is definitely something I said, and I'm very proud to say that I was wrong. I think being wrong is a beautiful thing because it allows us to learn. And I've been on a learning journey. The way in which I always viewed futures and design was that we would have a futures process, and we do the futures process, and we do all these lovely things about imagining the possible and probable futures, and we come up with these shared visions of the future, and then the futurist says, "Okay, cheers, I'm out. Find a designer to make sense of all this and create something now." Um, and One, that was a cop out because it doesn't get dirty and grapple with how does this vision of the future translate into action and reality today. Um, but two, it was the easy way out. It was really just run away very quickly. Um, and over the years, I've been grappling with how are we able to take a futures process that gives us a vision of the future and take a design process that can action some sort of an input, whether this is participatory and going to people thinking about future processes, and bring it together, not as a two standalone project or methodologies, but one framework that feeds off of each other. When we talk about, for example, the double diamond approach to design thinking, futures thinking also has a very similar kind of double diamond approach to futures thinking of expanding a conversation and contracting it around a set of ideas and expanding it again in contract. But how can we take these two and put them together? And that's what I hope FAD is for futures aided design is a way to not just have a vision of the future. Hermes is sharing his screen. There we go. That's double diamonds. And you can see, to just talk through this double diamond approach here, you can see the diamond starts and expands. It goes out into thinking and getting information and inputs. Then it narrows those inputs down into a set of, and then expands again. Um, but how can we to put these futures double diamond and the design double diamond together so that they feed off of each other? I'm going to talk more. Please hop in here. But to think of if we have a vision of the future, that vision of the future has to interact with the realities of the present, the design thinking process, the policy creation process. And the data, the insight that come out of that process needs to be able to relate back to the futures thinking, to the vision, to these ideas, and reshape those ideas. If we don't have this interaction, our visions of the future become outdated. If we were designing for a future that we had decided 10 years ago, for example, in climate, we have a vision of a climate future and that was 10 years old. Today, that vision is outdated. Today, we know that 1.5 degree increase or a 2 degree increase is no longer possible. If we were still designing for that outdated version, that outdated vision, our designs upon release are already outdated. They already not fit for purpose. If we were designing for a gender inclusive world, and the vision of a gender inclusive world was 20 years old today, anything that any policy we create is outdated because the world is changing. So how can we merge these two that aren't just separate from each other, but truly intertwined, iterative, double looped together? And that is what futures aided design does.
Because let me see, I think we've just given the audience like the solution a little bit more, right? Like we've created futures aided design because the problem that we're seeing is that potentially people who are mostly only trained in futures and people who are mostly only trained in design, like it would be better together because if the futurist is like piecing out after the futures workshop and people are have their vision of the future and they're creating a solution for it, like, and they're not coming back to the futures process again, then then they might be working with something outdated in as little as like one like time block of whatever, a quarter, a year, 5 years, etc. But by working together with a team, with someone who is both trained in futures and in design, you're able to integrate and prepare that team for iterating both and making sure that the data and the learnings that you get from the design process are feeding back into a futures process so that people have a chance to update what the design that they're working on is. Is that getting to a little bit more to it?
Yes, 100%. Um, this 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 interrelationship between the two, and you're saying like putting them together, is a step that has been missing. Um, if in the current way of working, where we have a futurist that does something and then a design thing will come in later, in order for these things to feed off of each other, you're basically going to have to go back to that futurist somewhere down the line and bring them back in here or go back and rework all of these things. And it's very expensive. We all know that these things aren't free. Like people need to somehow do things. But it also becomes a huge stumbling block. Now I need to go find time in this person's calendar to come back in and make sense of it all. But if we can do it together, it by design feeds off of each other. Um, in the same way how design thinking by design is iterative and futures thinking by design is iterative. But putting them together, this whole thing becomes more self-feeding and iterative
Rich.
along the
It
way.
becomes
Yes.
richer in the data that you get, which goes to this question, Alex. Alex, loving your questions. Nuria, thanks for your response. How can we check if it's an accurate reality? I think if I understand correctly, Romano, the thing is, with the probable and possible futures, until we reach there, it's not actually like we're living in the future, right? We're living in the future of 5 years ago, but we're trying to influence what's to come. And I think that where we're checking is where design methods helps out a lot because in design thinking, we're working with people affected by the problems that we know will affect the outcomes of what futures that we're looking
Mm-hmm.
to create or to increase the probability of achieving. Um, if we're working to mitigate the effects of climate change and we have, the quantitative numbers, at the end of the day, even those numbers, they're not 100%, right? Like scientific theory. So if we're assuming that these numbers that we're getting around climate change are based on the Western scientific method, which I do believe 100% in this case. But we're always taught, right, when we learn the scientific method that theories are only like theories that we hold until they're proven otherwise as well. Like we hold them as truth strongly until, of course, we prove them otherwise. And in this case, futures assisted design, I think what we're trying to say is like, let's make sure that we're consistently testing, experimenting,
Mm-hmm.
checking with the people affected by the problems. In the
Yes.
case of climate change, everyone, right? That's one of the challenges with climate change, our climate futures in particular, is because it's difficult to integrate the lived experiences and data that we get from as many people on the planet as much as possible, given the multitudes of latitudes and longitudes and all the
Yeah.
microclimates that exist and the effects of people. So that effects of climate change has on all of these different people.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know if I have an answer specifically to your question, Alex. I have an answer that we can check by including as many people as possible and having tools that integrate and involve as many people as possible.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, but the accuracy of the reality that we want is only defined, I think, by like our ability to integrate the lived experiences today of as many people as possible.
And to I don't want to come out here saying, hey, we have this thing called future-aided design or future-assisted design. FAD is the tool that we need to use. That is, I don't think anything that we're saying here. Something that I often say is you use the tool, you solve the problem using the tool that you know. If you go to a psychologist for an issue, for example, the psychologist will use the tools at their disposal, whether that is conversation, art-based therapy, etc., to help you solve your problem. If you take that same problem to a psychiatrist, that person might prescribe medication to help solve the problem. If you go to a surgeon, they'll want to cut you open and to poke a look and see what's up inside. What we're hoping for, and what I'm going to speak for Insight in general, very bold to do, but what we're hoping for here with futures aided design is to add another into this toolbox so that we can pull out and use when appropriate. Because sometimes not everything needs a hammer or a screwdriver. Sometimes we need different. And I think that also gets to this question of how do we recalibrate it properly? How do we create more participatory futures? How do we create fun, which was a topic that we spoke about so many times? Liberating structures that we spoke about on Monday, and DEI work that we spoke about on Wednesday, and FAD today will all be used to a certain extent interchangeably as you go through this process, because the tool we use is very important, and we need a nice big toolbox in my fantastic.
Okay. As I come to the end of this hour, I do want to make sure that we also touch upon the title of today's webinar, which is going beyond paper prototypes as well. But I think that that's okay, because actually the going beyond paper prototypes part is actually perhaps one of the easier pieces, but is largely forgotten in today's practice of design by most people for many different reasons, of course. But what I mean by this is actually getting to the manufacturing part. Like, how are we actually making sure that we are advocating for the resources to actually build something and to be thinking about how a prototype can be manufactured. And I'm not only talking about like literally physical things, but manufactured and designed and built and then put to scale as well. In the original sort of methods of design thinking, it was an engineering school that actually thought about this, and there was a root in actually taking out the hammer and the nail and building something. Of course, today we also have code and we have like process that we can also put together, but thinking about actually putting things to practice, things that actually change a person's lived experience, whether through its process, interaction with an object, or walking through a service that's being created. These are where we're going to get our real insights. And actually, this does come back to Alex's question too about how do we check if it's an accurate reality, rather than something that we just perceive. You give people something that changes the way that they do things with their lives, and I wanted to make sure that we touch upon this, because everything that we've talked about now is how to get people like into the room, into the conversation, feeling like they can be a part of it. The next step is really about now how do people build together, physically build something. The research that I was doing when I was doing my master's was around essentially bringing together scientists, engineers, artists, economists, put them in the same room and say, build a microscope. What happens when you get a whole bunch of people together to physically make an object that can be used, and what happens to those people's perceptions of the world and their own reality? In this case, about the microscope, when an artist can build a microscope, what happens to their understanding of who can be a scientist? When a scientist is asked to build their own tools, what happens to and what happens to their own ability to do science outside of a laboratory or an institution? These are the things that will push us to actually say we can make a difference in our future. because they know that together and individually they can actually build something. The third step is scaling that up. How do we take it from a group of 6 people in a workshop and actually say, what are the resources required and what is the advocacy that this group needs to do that has had this change in experience to convince others to put resources into this? And as designers, as facilitators, as managers here in this room, we are just starting this process of really, saying like we need to advocate for our clients and our partners to put in the resources for people to actually build things that change, even in small ways, how people interact with others and the world
Mm-hmm.
in regards to the problems that we're actually looking to solve. That will have long-term effects on the probable and possible futures that
Yeah.
we are all hoping for together.
And if I may just come in here as well, I see Nuria's question right here in the chat, which is, um, what is your view on how to best take action, considering most of the world is run under a command and control mindset? And we could have a 2 week conversation um, about this, or about my favorite. My partner will tell you I wake up and I talk about socialism in the morning. First thing in the morning is oh God. But um, I think that there are something we've been working on at Insight Pact here in Bangkok is to start developing a community of people who are um, woodwork factories, the plastic fabricators, or ways in which we can take your paper prototype, your idea, and take it beyond the drawing, beyond the paper model, and not just connect it to somebody who can fabricate a concept, but potentially start looking into production models, circular design structures that really go beyond the idea, but makes it real. So when you go back to the boardroom or to the community or to government, it isn't just, hey, here's the idea. Here's the idea, here's how it works, and here's the production line that could support increase. Um,
I'll take it even a step simpler, Romano, in terms of this response to Nuria's question, which is which is also a theme that's been throughout this entire week, is that oftentimes we can only begin with ourselves, knowing, of course, that there are power structures that will affect perhaps bigger decisions. But one of the simplest things in terms of best taking action when we're talking about creating futures for ourselves too is go take a sewing class. Do that coding school that you've been wanting to do, or the free coding lesson. Like the more that you are also able to, like, so this is Romano was talking about building partnerships with fabrication labs and places that can make things. The perhaps another simple one is also learn how to do it yourself and reconnect. I think so much of our theme this week has been about finding that sense of curiosity again, bringing that play back into our lives. And I'm going to repeat it for this webinar, which is also that like our hands are powerful as well. We've been talking about our lived experiences are powerful, our thoughts are powerful, our conversations can be powerful. And I am also saying that our hands are also very powerful, like being able to plant and grow even a tomato plant, for example, which is actually very difficult to do from seed. But these are some easy steps too, to just start with ourselves, in addition to everything else that we've talked about. Okay, I have lied to you all. I'm over time now. This is the first time this week that I'm over time. Romano, you get 2 more sentences before I
okay.
close up here.
Before Hermes closes off, in the chat, I'm just going to put down 1 or 2 links. The first link here is to the Journal of Future Studies. This is based in Taiwan. If you want to learn more about future studies, it's a great resource. It's free. The public, everything on the website is free, if I'm not mistaken. So go explore, read. It could get very heady. I apologize. But also reach out to me if you want to talk more about this. I'm more than happy to have conversations with anybody. And then the last link that I'm going to put in here, and I'm going to try and find it at home, is hopefully you have it, but it's the link to FAD. So when we talk about futures aided design, or FAD, this methodology that we're talking about, we are going to be running this at Insight Pact in January. Um, so if you really want to learn more about it, please reach out to us. Go look at the website. I'll be releasing a white paper about FAD that will explain everything very shortly. I'm just trying to work through some last comments, and this will be released on our website at Insight Pact as well as to other parts. So if you want that, please also send your email addresses to us. We have
We
them, I
have
think.
we have we'll send it out in the communication after this as well, so people will have these
Perfect.
resources. Yeah.
Awesome. But yeah,
Um,
this isn't the end of the conversation. Please reach out, and I like talking. So please
that's not even.
talk with
Oh,
me.
actually, the ask here is not even converse with us more, although we would love you to. It is come practice with us. Like
Yes,
that is what we need to do also, is to say that this method is, we want to put it into practice. We're laying some of the groundwork, but it's only going to be better with all of you a part of it. So with that, I want to say my final thank yous for this week to my team who have been working to set this all up for the entire professional development week. I think that we're excited to be repeating this with a new set of speakers at some point in the very near future. So please do look out for that. I want to say thank you to Romano for preparing and joining me in this conversation today. And of course, to all of you here taking the time out of your day to listen to me and Romano going back and forth, and all of our speakers from this week. It would not have been as rich without your contributions and your questions. Truly, truly. So thank you very much. Looking forward to seeing you all again, teacher. Have a wonderful day.